Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. Today's podcast is part of a series on the Workology Podcast that focuses on the roles and responsibilities of the Chief Human Resources Officer, or CHRO. I call this our CHRO series, and it is powered by the folks at Daily Pay. The CHRO sometimes is also called the VP of Talent and Culture or the Chief People Officer. It's an executive level role that deals with managing human resources, as well as with organizational development and implementing policies of change to improve the overall efficiency of the company. Today, I'm joined by Jay Moldenhauer-Salazar. He's the Chief People Officer at Minted.com. He received his PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan with his dissertation on organizational change and diversity. After several years running a lab in Silicon Valley, he went on to lead HR in multiple industries, including stints at Sun Microsystems, Taco Bell, BlackRock, Gap and Old Navy, Starbucks, and Riot Games. Jay, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
What an interesting background. I love this. You've been in HR at the executive level for about 20 years. How has your role evolved over time into this Chief People Officer role?
Well, I'm glad you think it's interesting because hearing it tires me out. It makes me feel very gray-haired. Before I was a Chief People Officer, I spent most of my career actually alternating between specialist and generalist roles, it happened by circumstance, but it's something I really recommend to people regardless of their HR career aspirations, whether they want to be a CHRO or not. Being a specialist gives you a unique perspective on the challenges of creating something for employees, and being a generalist gives you a unique perspective on delivering something to employees, and obviously the daily challenges that leaders and managers face. So it's interesting spending time in either a specialist or generalist shoes, I think makes you better at the other. And it's something that I did pretty regularly before taking on that top role. But honestly, the main reason that I am a Chief People Officer is because a number of people egging me on and believing that I should do that. I have often, this is not a new concept, but I've often made the distinction between mentors and sponsors. Mentors are people who have your best interests at heart. They could be peers, uncles, managers, anything. But sponsors are people who have your best interests at heart, but who also have the power to create opportunities for you. And I was never really ready for most of the roles that I got, but I was being dragged there by a group of sponsors who just believed that I could do more and believed that I could be in that top role and made opportunities happen for me. Sometimes, even before I ever felt like I was ready for them. In fact, like I said, I don't think I was ready for most of the roles that I stepped into.
Thank you for that. And I moving on from like the sponsors and the mentors conversation, one other thing I noticed when I looked at your sort of resume and looking at your experience is that you have worked with mostly enterprises and Fortune 500 companies, but the last two jobs have been for much smaller organizations. So can you talk about this progression? Because normally it's the other way, not reverse, but why this change and how has it worked for you?
Well, it may be TMI for a work podcast, but I actually had a very textbook midlife crisis and realized that there was something about the ways my career had evolved that were, deeply unsatisfying. And that led me from these large multinational global enterprises who are terrific brands, terrific employers, to these smaller, scrappier, high growth kind of startups. And there's definitely aspects about smaller organizations that feel different from larger ones. The first is probably the energy and the urgency that exists in smaller organizations. There's just a kind of speed and I don't know, dynamism that exists in smaller organizations that I think pulls on different muscles or works different muscles than larger organizations. And the second is this sort of unavoidable ownership and entrepreneurship that is required to be in a smaller organization. There's literally no one else to solve the problem for you, so you have to solve it yourself. And the amount of resources, infrastructure that exists at large organizations isn't there. And so you are often having to do things scrappily or, in ways that get it done with what you've got available. And that is, it's just, again, it's a different way of working. Ironically, I actually think I'd be more effective in larger organizations now because of those two things. I think it would be great if more larger organizations had that level of energy and urgencies of smaller companies. And, I think ownership, particularly even more than entrepreneurship, but ownership matters no matter where you are. And it's something I think I've learned more deeply in smaller companies than larger ones.
Well, and let me just say on the TMI front, I'm all TMI all the time. So I have written and talked and spoke about all sorts of things related to my personal life because they do bleed over into your professional life. So I'm so glad that you had a midlife crisis and here you are.
Well, 2014 was not my favorite year, but it has been a wonderful journey in hindsight. It's been great.
Now that we know, or now that you've shared about, working in HR in small and large organizations, I wanted to hear about the skills and experiences that you believe are absolute requirements for the CHRO role. But I'm also thinking are there different skills and experience requirements for the scrappy startup or small business versus the large enterprise? So I would be interested in your point of view here for sure.
Yeah, I think they're actually the same, interestingly. I mean, there's some technical skills that are different, whether if you're in a pre-IPO startup, you don't need necessarily to have kind of the ability to work with comp committees and boards and that sort of thing as much as large enterprise public company CHRO, but a lot of the core competencies are the same. And I think they mostly come down to, in my mind, the three biggest ones are business acumen, drive for results, and judgment. Across every industry, and as you say, I've been in a lot of them, and across all scales and sizes, the most successful HR people are the ones who know the business, who get stuff done, and who have great judgment when given the chance to exhibit it. Now, I think it's a little hardest to teach judgment. To me, that sort of comes from learning and experience and having that kind of learner's mindset for every time you fail or succeed. But the others are definitely teachable. And it's also why caring about your company's products, I think, matters, or because it's a faster path to business acumen. But, if you have that ability to see a problem, wrestle it to the ground, solve it, and do that in ways that matter to driving the business forward, I think you're going to be successful at any part of HR, especially that CHRO role. The other thing I would say is, I think probably mid-career, I started to learn that HR programs and products and policies are best if you treat them like consumer products or programs. And we need to have a product mindset in HR. And I think that leads to very successful CHROs. CEOs can connect with their heads of HR if they're bringing a product lens to what they're doing and just treating their internal customers as customers. And then I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but data acumen is something that as you say, I ran a research lab in Silicon Valley. I came out of graduate school thinking of myself more as a statistician than an HR person. I don't think I even knew what HR was when I came out of grad school. And I think that's actually been one of the fastest paths I've had to being able to influence senior teams, is the ability to use data for decision making and being able to speak the same language as my business peers.
We are going to talk about data, but one of the things I wanted to ask you before we move into that area is the shift to remote work.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have a call center or had a call center in Oakland, California, but you've had some significant changes in the business and how you are growing as an organization or driving revenue since the pandemic began. And I wanted to ask what the biggest challenge was and what you learned from that.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Minted is a crowdsourced e-commerce platform selling things like stationery in the form of wedding invitations, baby announcements, holiday cards, that sort of thing. But increasingly also art and home decor. We have artists in 100 different countries around the world, and we crowdsource design using consumer panels to figure out which designs we should sell on our site or through wholesalers. And it's been a wonderful business for most of its 14 years of existence. And weddings was a hugely wonderful business to be in until 2020, when people stopped getting married. So 2020 was a little bit of a rough year for us. But it did allow a lot of other parts of our business to flourish because people were sitting at home, staring at blank walls, wanting artwork or wanting to stay connected through cards. The biggest shift for us internally was that we didn't even have a remote work policy and we were one of the first companies in San Francisco to move to work from home. Miriam Nafisi, our CEO, she is many things, a real brand visionary, amazing entrepreneur. She's also a little bit of a germaphobe, and I think was tracking coronavirus news before many of her peers. So we moved to work from home in, I think, March 1st in 2020, so very early in the pandemic. And that was a huge shift for us. And I think it was probably the biggest shift was for our customer operations, or our call center, as you said, which is about a third of our company, a call center that had sit in Oakland for the entirety of the company's history. And not everyone in our customer operations team even had their own laptops. So we had to get people laptops, get them working from home, and set up a whole bunch of ways of working and policies that didn't exist before. And we were, as a company, kind of set up for face-to-face decision-making. And it has been a huge amount of learning about how to do communication and keep people aligned when you can't see one another face-to-face. We've really had to think about mental health and burnout for our employees, which I think has been true of all of my peers in other industries and other companies as I talk to them. And onboarding has been a real challenge. So I think all of those things have been huge places of kind of our learning curve. Some of the alignment issues we've tackled through technology, which has been great. It's kind of accelerated our technology roadmap internally. We've tackled our mental health and burnout through enhanced benefits. There's some wonderful things that have come out that like Ginger and others, just other offerings that have been fantastic for people to give them access to online mental health care. Onboarding has probably been the toughest. There's a Harvard professor I know, really love, Youngmi Moon. She said something recently on a podcast that I just really think about a lot. She said that part of working is an individual sport, and that is really possible. That part is really easy to do remotely. Part of working is a team sport, which is very difficult to do remotely, but possible. It just has a lot of challenges associated with it. And then part of work is a spectator sport. It's watching how things get done, understanding the culture through watching meetings, understanding who is where and how the company works by watching it unfold. And that part's essentially impossible done remotely. And what I've noticed is all the people we've hired since the pandemic began and have onboarded, where they struggle is with that spectator sport part, making sense of how the company works and how the different departments fit together and how decisions get made. And that's the part I still feel like I'm very much on a learning curve to understand how to tackle.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. We're talking about the role of the CHRO and the importance of diversity and metrics and all the things with Jay Moldenhauer-Salazar. He's the Chief People Officer at Minted.com. Now, this interview is part of a series that I call the CHRO series, and it is powered by our friends at Daily Pay. Personal and professional development is essential for successful HR leaders. Join Upskill HR to access live training, community, and over 100 on-demand courses for the dynamic leader. HR Restart credits available. Visit upskillhr.com for more. Can you talk about your seasonal hiring and going fully remote? Because I know we talked about that in the prep call.
Yeah.
Just maybe talk us through that, because that was fascinating to me, like logistically and all the things that you guys were dealing with in real time.
Yeah. It was fascinating for me too. So our customer operations team, that third of the company, triples or even quadruples in size in our fourth quarter, where we do a ton of sales. And it's always been in Oakland. We've always expanded in Oakland. And suddenly in 2020, we were doing it virtually in markets we'd never been in. And that there was just a lot of gambles associated with that. We had to start doing hiring in places like Atlanta and Detroit and Dallas, Fort Worth, and just places, Sacramento, places where we'd never had to think about sort of our talent marketplace. And then we were suddenly mailing these very expensive laptops, because a lot of the work we do is design focused and requires some pretty good computing power. So we were sending these laptops to people knowing that they were only going to be with us for 3 months and hoping that they would, at the end of that 3 months, mail the laptop back to us. And the amount of sort of breath holding and risk taking that whole endeavor entailed was really profound. And what was, I don't know, made me kind of more, it made me believe in human beings more, I guess. We basically broke every customer service metric that we had. It was a success on every dimension. In fact, it was so successful that we're going to do it again this year, regardless of where we stand with the pandemic. We've already announced to the company that we are going to stay remote on the call center side of things through the end of this year. And what we found is people, first of all, we hadn't tapped out there was a certain amount of ways that we tapped out the Oakland talent market. There's only so many times you can quadruple that call center every fourth quarter and expect that you're going to get new people. Whereas with these other markets, there were all these people who were thrilled with the idea of joining this company, Minted, that was a sort of Bay Area tech company with a design focus. It was just, we had kind of a cool factor in a lot of those markets. And people had such a good experience that we got almost every single laptop back on time, and then a request to please let them know when we were doing it next year, because they'd love to work for us again. It was just a really positive experience. And like I said, they were just very engaged with the customers. The training went off really well remotely, and we had great results from a customer operations perspective. So, obviously for us, that's a huge cost savings for real estate if we decide to stay remote, which we haven't made that permanent decision yet. But for me, what I get most excited about are those other things. The ability to find talent nationwide, it sort of broadens the talent pool exponentially. And the idea that we can offer this uniquely positive experience for people is just really exciting. I think it never would have predicted a year ago that we would do a Q4 virtually and then decide to do it again. But that's where we're at, and it's been really fun.
I love that, and thank you for sharing. I think these are the kind of stories that are such an important part of this podcast series. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about D&I. So, and again, I think your background is fascinating, because like we're talking about Minted and Scrappy Startup, and then I am doing research and I find that you established the first diversity and inclusion corporate goal in Gap Inc.'s history, and also led the D&I for Starbucks and all of its umbrella brands, and incorporated D&I into the talent process across 6 different industries, including hiring, performance management, and compensation. So I wanted to make sure we dove into that a little bit. So my question for you is, what should HR leaders keep in mind when it comes to improving their D&I at the company and trying to create organizational change in that area?
Yeah, as you mentioned at the beginning, my dissertation was on organizational change around issues of diversity. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart and something I care deeply about. And I really like the shift, just as an aside, of talking about diversity and inclusion, which is what it's been through most of my career, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think adding equity is something that we're trying to get, which is trying to get people who are not starting at the same start line to make up some of that ground. So, diversity is about having different backgrounds, perspectives, and ways of thinking in the same place. Inclusion is about making sure that those voices are heard, but equity is really about making sure that everyone's on an even playing field. And I really like the shift from D&I to DEI. And what I would say is, as I've been thinking about this issue, I really think HR leaders need to tackle this both top down and bottoms up. And the top down part is really important. Ultimately, the CEO, not just a leader or some of the leaders on the management team, but the CEO needs to believe in this as a core value, or else I just think progress is really difficult. Not impossible, but really difficult. And almost to a company, when I think about the case studies of organizations that made meaningful progress on DEI, it's because of either a new CEO or a CEO having some sort of revelatory experience, usually because of a crisis of some kind or some personal journey that they've been on that has them wake up to the fact that this is really, really important. Important. And so I really think that whatever you can do as an HR leader to have your CEO see this not as a moral issue, not as a business issue, but both. Something that is really, really fundamental to their business success and also their, personal values. I think that is hugely important. At the same time, you should be fostering bottoms up influence, and that usually happens through employee resource groups. And I've said ERGs go through from my perspective, pretty predictable life cycle or arc. And they start out as essentially, and this is going to sound maybe a little diminishing, but I'd really think it matters, is they start a little bit like social clubs. Like they are there for people who have some reason for identifying with other people, and they share food and music and cultural experiences with those folks. It's just nice to be around people like themselves. And so there's a huge sharing and kind of social fandom that happens in those employee resource groups. And that's kind of the foundation with which a lot of them get started. And then they become learning vehicles. They become places where people want speakers to come in, or it's an opportunity for employees in the company to take leadership roles that they wouldn't otherwise have access to within the ERGs. And they start thinking about the development of their members and what membership means. And that move from a kind of social connection to a learning vehicle is a really cool thing to watch. And then eventually they start to want to influence decisions at the company. So they start to ask questions about aspects of the culture or the internal HR policies, or they start to ask questions about the recruiting process, or they start to ask questions about the product set and why we don't have more products that speak to a particular audience. And that's when you start cooking with gas on ERGs. That's when they start really becoming almost like special interest groups within a political discussion or something. They start to influence senior leaders on thinking differently. And when they're really, really going well, I have seen CEOs say, we're thinking about doing this thing, but maybe I should go talk to our Black employee ERG first and get their perspective. And before we pull the trigger on this thing. So I think you need both. You need that kind of groundswell of the bottoms up energy, and there's things you can do to foster it. And then you need that CEO, not just buy-in, but really believing that it's something that matters. And if you get both of those things, then you can really, really move. And then the last thing I'll say is, and frustratingly, and maybe this is my own ineffectiveness or something, but I really do believe this is true. DEI change is slow, and it's partly that's because of the complexity of it, but I don't know what the other factors are that lead it to be slow. But I really think it's important for HR leaders to measure progress in years, not in quarters. If you set up a DEI dashboard and you expect that it's going to change month over month, you are going to be sorely disappointed. It is something that really takes a long time to start to see that the cogs moving and progress to be made. And I think I've watched organizations take really huge sweeping changes, and they still feel like they're years in the making of seeing it show up as results on kind of their internal demographics or the way that they think about product management or whatever. So anyway, those are a brain dump of thoughts on the topic of DEI.
This is great. And as you're talking, I am doodling like the ERG evolution. I think if you go, once this publishes, you go to workology.com and you look at the show notes, we're going to include an image. I just feel like it's visual representation for ERGs. And I feel like almost a large percentage of these CHRO interviews, like yours, Jay, are D&I or DEI is coming into the conversation, and ERGs are an increasingly important part of where a company is going, and the changes or enhancements that are being made in that organization, they are driven by those ERGs and the conversations that are having in there within them. So this is great.
I can't wait to see the visual.
Yeah, I'm gonna hat tip you here, because it's like I just wrote a little graphic. I'm gonna send it to my image team and they'll come up with something amazing. But I think that ERGs are it's a critical component of any effective diversity, equity, inclusion program within an organization. I want to shift gears again. Your background's so diverse. So, and you wrote this incredible article, which we will link to in the transcript of the podcast. So you're going to have the ERG evolution image and this article that you need to check out. It's from 2015 and it's called A Lack of HR Talent. And in the post, you talk about people choosing a career in HR because they like working with people. We hear this all the time, and why that is short-sighted. Can you talk a bit about that and what, if any, changes you have seen that have occurred since you wrote the article?
Yeah, I was in a group for a while where I was writing monthly LinkedIn blog posts, and that one was definitely the most widely shared and polarizing of the ones, and it's gotten a lot of discussion. Look, I actually do think getting into HR because you like people is important. And the reason I think it's important is because you end up seeing in HR people in their worst and most vulnerable moments. And so wanting to support people and enable people to be successful is a really important ingredient. But to borrow a legal term, liking people is a necessary but insufficient reason to go into HR. Just liking people, if that's the only thing that really is creating or cobbling together the function, is a bunch of people who like people, I really worry that HR becomes this kind of lowest common denominator function. It's where other people go because they don't have technical skills that help the business in other ways. And that sounds harsh, and that's what the article says. So that's why it was polarizing. But I really do think you need more. You need more than just being able to like people. You need to actually have a technical or hard skill set that you're bringing to the table. Now, the good news is, since I wrote that article, which was 6 years ago, I do think things are changing. Actually, for the first time in my career, I used to bemoan. In fact, I think even say in that article, I bemoaned that these are the same issues that I felt like were true 10 years ago, or 5 years before that. Now I actually do feel like there's a shift. I'm seeing more elite MBAs wanting to be in HR. I'm having a lot of career conversations with Stanford and Ivy League MBAs. I'm getting asked to consider public board of director seats, which I didn't think was going to happen in my lifetime. I'm seeing CHROs become presidents of business units in various places. So that wasn't happening before. And I think it's probably the combination of the complex challenges of a global pandemic, the issues of remote working, Black Lives Matter movement, and the larger DEI issues. You think about the last, I guess, 7, 8 years of talks of systemic gender inequity or institutional racism and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of CEOs are being forced to realize that many of their most critical issues sit in HR's lap. So I think it's nice to see the shift, and I feel like we're going to have a talent influx over time. But that's why, to me, what we do with that talent is they have to bring more than just liking people into the equation. They have to bring some harder skills.
I'm happy that you're seeing change, and I am also seeing change, and also this continued series interview with CHROs has been fascinating. And my goal truly is for us to have these kinds of conversations, and so that we can help shape future CHROs as they're thinking about their career, that it isn't cookie cutter, and that there is a lot more business strategy knowledge that is involved, metrics and numbers that's involved in the HR role than ever before. So we need to be seeking these things out now when we're in that specialist or generalist or coordinator role. And as we move and evolve into our career, we can pull from those experiences so that we can truly support the business and move into, like you said, presidents of divisions or CEOs or COO roles within the organizations in the future more than ever before. One of the areas I did also want to talk to you about, because of your background and your point of view, is the importance of data and metrics for HR decision making. So you have hinted on this a little bit as we've went through the entire podcast interview, but I want to focus on metrics for HR decision making, the role of metrics in change management, that organizational development side of things, and other HR initiatives, as we're being pulled into, thankfully, more conversations with executive leaders and into more of these different changes that are happening within our company. Finally, somebody's like, hey, we should probably talk to HR about this. So how does metrics and data, how is that shaping these new just changes and initiatives that are happening with HR's involvement?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of the punchline of that article you mentioned, which is HR needs to be better around data. And I think if we get crisper and clearer on the science of HR, I think we will significantly advance our credibility as a function. And I mentioned that CHROs need to have high business acumen. Actually, I think all HR people need to have high business acumen. And this is kind of an extension of that. You need to speak the language of the business, and how most business decisions get made is through data. And so you need to think in terms of value drivers and predictive analytics and algorithms, and think in terms of quantifying problems, even if they're people problems, in order to influence CEOs and leadership teams and be able to get things done. And the reason I think that this is particularly important for HR teams is because HR sits on a metric ton of data, hiring data, performance data, compensation data, exit data, demographic data, benefits data, employee survey data, just all of this information. But in my experience, we're not often mining those data in order to learn and have insights into what's really going on in an organization. So the more you as an HR professional can get comfortable with jumping into those data sets, cleaning them up, and using them for decision making, I think the more effective you'll be. And if you as an HR leader if you feel like that's a little bit out of your depth, then hire a data scientist, hire an insights or analytics person who is focused on people issues and people data, and you will be amazed at how quickly the conversations advance with that kind of rigor and nuanced understanding of data sets being applied to the data that you're using. And I can't say it more strongly enough. I think it is the key to unlocking having HR feel like a administrative function, a reactive function, one that sits kind of is the tail rather than the dog, to move into this, strategic influencer of the direction of the company. It is your ability to take data, understand it, and use it for decision making. I think that is the single biggest driver of moving from that first place to the second place.
I love it. And thank you for taking the time to share all these insights and experiences. I absolutely appreciate it. I know everybody who's listening is saying the same thing. Where can people go, Jay, to learn more about you and the work you're doing at minted.com?
You can always hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty stingy with accepting invite requests, but I'm pretty generous in responding to LinkedIn mail. So feel free to connect with me there. I do have a Twitter account at MagicJMS. That's as much kind of nerd game stuff, which is my other identity, as it is business stuff. But every once in a while, I do have some business stuff there. Other than that, I think you can always email me at jay.msalazar@minted.com. Happy to take inquiries there. Everything else on social media, all the other social media accounts I have is mostly just to keep track of my teenagers. So probably not a good use of those.
But that's kind of why we get on social media. I also want to link to the minted.com website so you can kind of check it out and take a look at the jobs page or their careers page too. So you can kind of keep up with what's going on as you guys move into your busy season with
thank you,
with all that crazy hiring that's going to be going on. How fun.
Yeah. And I will say we are definitely in growth mode in 2021, and our headquarters is in San Francisco, but increasingly we're having more remote roles as our sort of mindset evolves. And also we are expanding hugely in the Kansas City metropolitan area. So if you happen to be in the Midwest and have an interest in Kansas City and almost any functional area, we are probably hiring for it. So check out our jobs page.
Fun fact, I'm from Kansas originally.
What?
So yeah. I graduated from K-State and lived in Kansas City and worked at Home Depot and opened up stores and ran regional HR stuff there. So I love KC. It's such a good place.
Well, all right. If you also have that KC connection, actually, Jessica, if you want to apply, we have an HR director role open. So go for it.
Well, I might know some people who could be a good fit. So I'll circulate that for you for sure. Well, thank you so much, Jay, for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoy it. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Are you loving the Workology podcast? Our Workology community reaches over 600,000 HR leaders every single month. Want to be a sponsor? Reach out to us at workology.com/advertising. It's interesting to delve into a role like the CHRO whose experience more closely connects them to the strategy and operations of the overall business and how this works with the rest of the company, especially when you're dealing with a global pandemic and how you have to be flexible and agile. And not to mention being able to use data to help drive your decisions. It doesn't matter if it's a DEI or organizational change. I love the conversation that we had with Jay today, and I appreciate him taking the time to chat with us today. This podcast is part of our CHRO series, and it is powered by friends at Daily Pay. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, which is sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and until next time, you can visit Workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.